In a forgotten mountain village where snow buries both dreams and hope, a poor girl named Elsie lives in silence, unseen, underestimated, and barely surviving. But when the river cracks and a man plunges into its icy grip, everything changes. Risking her life, Elsie pulls him from the frozen waters, unaware that the stranger she saves is no ordinary man. He's the secret owner of the entire valley. As he recovers in her humble cabin, a bond forms between the one built on kindness, resilience, and unspoken truths. Yet Daniel carries a secret colder than the river, his identity as heir to the Hartmore fortune, hidden for years, now stirred awake by the warmth of a girl who has nothing but gives everything. When the truth emerges, the village turns. Elsie doubts herself, and old wounds reopen. But sometimes the coldest winters reveal the warmest hearts. This is a story of rescue, revelation, and redemption, of a girl who thought she was powerless, and a man who forgot what true power meant. Poor girl rescues man from icy river. She finds out he owns the whole valley. But what she doesn't know is that she owns his heart. Stay with us. The river has only begun to thaw. The wind howled like a hungry beast across the mountains, sweeping powdery snow into the narrow valley where the village of Greystone lay, frozen in time. The kind of place where no one came unless they were born there, and few stayed unless they had nowhere else to go. Wooden cabins leaned into the hills like weary travelers, roofs sagging under the weight of ice and history. Smoke curled from chimneys like whispers of warmth in a place otherwise forgotten by the world. In the smallest cabin on the edge of the woods, a girl moved quietly through the biting cold. Elsie Ward, 17, threadbare coat wrapped tightly around her slender frame, stepped carefully over frozen roots as she gathered the last of the firewood she had stashed before the storm. Her fingers, red from frost, trembled as she tied the bundle together with twine. The sun was slipping behind the ridge, and she needed to return before darkness set in. Home wasn't far, a crooked little structure patched with love and desperation. Inside, her mother lay in bed, coughing softly, her breath clouding in the chill air. The fire had burned low, and Elsie's heart clenched. The sickness was getting worse. The village had long stopped caring. Her father had disappeared years ago after being accused of theft from the Hartmore estate, a name whispered with contempt by some, reverence by others. His departure, whether by choice or force, had cast a shadow on the Wards. Since then, Elsie had been labeled the thief's daughter, her mother the madwoman who still waited at the window. But Elsie bore it all. She endured the sneers at the market, the raised prices, the cold shoulders. What choice did she have? There was no one else. She chopped wood, mended clothes, and took care of her mother without complaint. She never dreamed of luxury, only of a day without hunger, a winter without fear. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Elsie trudged back with her bundle. As she passed the river's edge, the one that split the valley like a scar, something stopped her. A sound, faint, desperate, not the groaning ice or snapping twigs. A voice. Help. She froze, straining to hear, then again, clearer this time. Someone, please. Dropping the wood, she ran toward the sound. Her boots slipped on the icy path as she reached the riverbank. There, tangled between the jagged ice floes, a figure flailed in the black water. A man, his face pale, his arms clinging to a half-submerged log. "Hold on," Elsie shouted, scanning for anything, rope, branch, anything she could use. She found a broken sled runner and edged closer to the water. Ice cracked beneath her feet. The man was losing strength fast. Elsie gritted her teeth and crawled forward. lying flat to distribute her weight. She extended the runner. "Grab it!" He barely managed, fingers slipping. With one last desperate heave, she pulled, legs braced, breath burning in her chest. The man came up, half on the ice, half in the water. One more pull and he collapsed beside her, shivering violently. He was tall, soaked, and unconscious before she could even ask his name. Elsie stared down at him, heart pounding. Her breath came in gasps. She had just pulled a full-grown man from a frozen river, alone. She looked around. No one, not even a bird in the trees. The silence returned, heavy and unbroken. Somewhere in the back of her mind she heard her mother's coughing, but she couldn't leave him. Without another thought, she gathered the man's frozen limbs and with all the strength she had, began dragging him toward home, toward the warmth of a dying fire. What she didn't know as the snow fell harder was that the man she'd just saved would change everything she thought she knew about her past and her future. The river was no longer silent. It had spoken, and she had answered. The snow thickened as Elsie dragged the stranger across the slippery ground. Her breath came in ragged gasps, fogging before her as sweat froze against her brow. The man was heavy, his clothes drenched and stiff with ice. Each step was a battle against the biting wind and her own exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She reached the cabin after what felt like an eternity. Pushing the door open with her shoulder, she stumbled inside, pulling him after her. The room was dim, the single oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Her mother stirred weakly, coughing. "Elsie," her voice rasped. "It's okay, Mama. I'm here." She threw a blanket over her mother before turning to the stranger. She stripped off his frozen coat, wincing at the icy water that had soaked through. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue, hands trembling. He needed warmth, fast. She lit the fire with the wood she'd gathered earlier, coaxing the flames to life. She remembered her father's words long ago. If someone falls into the river, you have minutes. Heat their core, get them dry. She worked quickly, layering wool blankets over him, placing warm stones near his sides. She hesitated, then stripped off his soaked shirt and replaced it with one of her father's old flannels. The man groaned softly. His eyes fluttered open. "Where?" he murmured. "You're safe," Elsie whispered, gently pressing a warm cloth to his cheek. "You fell into the river. I pulled you out." His eyes tried to focus. They were a piercing gray blue, shocked, confused. "Who are you?" "Elsie Ward. I live here with my mother." "Thank you," he whispered before his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into unconsciousness again. Elsie sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the adrenaline ebbing away. She had no idea who this man was, why he'd been by the river, or what he was doing in the valley. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered for now. The next morning the fire had dwindled to embers, but the stranger was still alive. Elsie woke to find him sitting up, leaning against the wall, his face pale but alert. He looked out the frosted window as if trying to place where he was. She handed him a mug of thin broth. "Careful, it's hot." He accepted it with a nod, sipping slowly. "You saved my life." "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" Elsie blinked. "Because you were drowning." The man looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to read more from her than she was willing to say. He finally offered a weak smile. "I'm Daniel. Just Daniel. For now," he said, his voice still hoarse. "You wouldn't believe the full story anyway." Elsie raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She knew people had their reasons. Still, curiosity simmered beneath her calm surface. His manner was refined. His accent didn't belong to anyone from Greystone, and his clothes, though soaked and torn, were clearly expensive. "I should get back on my feet soon," he said. "I've imposed it long enough." "You're not strong enough," she replied firmly. "You nearly froze to death." "I've endured worse," he murmured, looking away. They fell into silence. Elsie tended to her mother, who stared at Daniel with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. In the evenings, Elsie read aloud by the fire, books borrowed from the church or gifted by a kind old teacher before he left town. Daniel listened quietly, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just watching her. Days passed, and Daniel regained his strength, but his story remained hidden, locked behind those storm-colored eyes. By the end of the week, word had spread like wildfire through Greystone. Elsie Ward was harboring a stranger. Children whispered it behind their hands. Women in the bakery stopped talking when Elsie walked in. Mr. Collins, the butcher, gave her cold, sidelong glances as he wrapped up her soup bones. "She brings a man into her home," someone said, "and they aren't even married. Maybe she's finally found someone foolish enough to marry her." Elsie tried to ignore them, but it hurt. Every day she carried buckets of water, chopped wood, and bartered for medicine. Yet all people saw was scandal. One afternoon, Reverend Harrow came knocking, a kindly man but firm in his views. "Elsie," he said gently, "people are talking. Perhaps it's best if your guest moves on." "He's not strong enough," she said, "and they can talk all day like, I'd rather save a life than save face." He sighed but said nothing more. Inside, Daniel listened. Later that evening, he said quietly, "You're braver than I gave you credit for." "I've had to be," she replied. "No one else is going to stand up for me." He looked at her long and hard. "Then maybe it's time someone did." Elsie said nothing, but a flicker of warmth, something not from the fire, spread in her chest. The village might whisper, but a bond was forming, one the cold couldn't freeze and no gossip could break. The snow came again, heavier this time. It blanketed the valley in silence, burying pathways and muffling every sound. For 3 days, the village of Greystone seemed to vanish under a shroud of white, and in that stillness, the cabin on the edge of the woods became its own little world. Inside, the fire crackled. Elsie was mending a quilt by the hearth. Daniel sat at the table staring into the steam rising from his tea. His recovery had been slow but steady. The color had returned to his cheeks, and he no longer needed help standing. Still, there was a quiet heaviness in him, a guardedness she couldn't quite breach. "Do you miss where you're from?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Daniel looked up, blinking. "That's a complicated question." Elsie tilted her head. "Why? If it's home, shouldn't it be simple?" He gave a wry smile. "Not when home is the very thing you tried to escape." There it was again, a glimpse of something deeper. She waited, letting silence stretch comfortably between them. Finally he sighed. "I was raised in a world of estates and expectations. Everything was polished, elegant, suffocating. My parents passed when I was young. The valley, this valley, became mine. But I left. I couldn't stand the weight of it all." Elsie's needle paused. "You own land here?" Daniel hesitated. "Not anymore, at least not in the way I used to. Let's just say I've kept distance from it." Her mind raced, trying to connect dots, but she let it go. "So, what brought you back?" He looked at her, eyes suddenly vulnerable. "I think I forgot what real things felt like. Then I remembered the river, I remembered the woods, the snow, and I came to remember who I was. She nodded slowly, not pressing further. Instead, she offered him a journal and pen. "What's this?" he asked. "You talk like someone who needs to write." I thought maybe it would help. Daniel accepted it with a quiet thanks. That night, after she went to bed, he stayed up by the fire, scribbling into the blank pages, and though she didn't know it yet, those words would one day become a record of everything that would change for both of them. The storm eased briefly, revealing a silver world beneath a pale winter sun. With the main roads buried, only the most determined travelers moved across the valley. One such traveler, a passing trader named Micah, stopped by the cabin to barter for shelter. Elsie welcomed him, offering stew and a warm bed in the loft. In return, he gave them salted pork and news from the village. "Council's in a twist," he muttered over dinner. "Someone said they saw a carriage coming through the east ridge, all polished wood and gold crests." Elsie glanced at Daniel, but he betrayed no reaction. After Micah left the next morning, Daniel sat at the table with parchment and ink. He wrote in silence, folded the letter carefully, and sealed it with wax from Elsie's candle. "I need you to send this," he said. "To who?" He hesitated. "Someone I haven't spoken to in a long time, a man who once worked for my family." Elsie took the letter. "You still won't tell me your full name." "Not yet," he replied, "but soon." She left the letter with Micah, who promised to deliver it. When she returned, she found Daniel outside, staring up at the sky. "Snow's coming again," he said. "How do you know?" He smiled. "I grew up learning the signs. Clouds like that, they don't mean anything good." As the first flakes began to fall, Elsie wondered just how much more Daniel knew about the valley, about her, about the past he refused to share. By nightfall, the snow was no longer falling gently. It came down in thick sheets, driven sideways by wind that rattled the cabin walls. The trees groaned under the weight, branches snapping like bones. The storm, when it arrived, didn't whisper. It roared. The village was caught off guard, with the main storehouse low on supplies and the roads impassable. Panic took hold. Fires struggled to stay lit. Pipes froze. Families huddled together, desperate. Elsie's cabin on the edge of the forest was spared the worst, thanks in part to Daniel's foresight. He had helped her reinforce the roof and windows earlier that week. But the morning after the worst of it, a knock came at the door. 3 villagers, men who had once ignored her, stood shivering on her porch. "Our fire's gone out. My youngest has a fever," one of them said. "Please, help us." Elsie looked to Daniel. Without a word, he nodded. They brought the family in. Then others came. A widow with a sick infant, a boy with frostbite, a farmer whose cow had frozen in the night. Soon the small cabin became a makeshift shelter. Daniel took charge, quietly, efficiently. He organized rations, directed woodcutting efforts, even melted snow for clean water. People began to notice. "He's not just a traveler," one man whispered. "He knows things. Feels like he's been here before." Elsie watched him move among the people with grace and confidence. This wasn't just a man grateful to be alive. This was a leader, a man who had once commanded rooms far grander than hers. And as he stirred the fire that night, speaking softly to a child who cried, Elsie began to realize something. The storm hadn't brought ruin. It had brought revelation. 3 days after the blizzard, the sky cleared and the valley shimmered like a world newly born. Snow draped over every roof and tree branch, a pristine layer that softened the rugged features of the land. But within Greystone, the aftermath of the storm revealed more than just broken fences and frozen wells. It uncovered quiet truths. The villagers, grateful to Elsie for shelter and to Daniel for his calm leadership, began looking at her differently. She was no longer just the thief's daughter. Whispers of admiration replaced gossip. Still, she felt uneasy. Gratitude was fickle in Greystone. That morning, as she stepped outside to collect firewood, she heard it. A sound she hadn't heard in years. Wheels crunching over ice. A carriage, polished wood gleaming even through slush and snow, rumbled down the ridge road. Two black horses trotted in front. A liveried driver held the reins. Behind him sat a man in a dark coat and bowler hat. Elsie froze. Daniel came up beside her. "It's him," he said quietly. "Mr. Alcott, my family's legal advisor." The carriage stopped in front of the cabin. Alcott stepped down, brushing snow off his shoulders. He looked at Daniel and gave a respectful bow. "Mr. Hartmore," he said, "the valley has been looking for you." Gasps rippled from the villagers who'd come to see the commotion. One by one, eyes turned to Daniel Hartmore, the heir to the estate, the owner of the land beneath their feet. Elsie's chest tightened. She had known he carried secrets, but this? Daniel stepped forward, his voice clear. "Yes, I am Daniel Hartmore. I've returned, not to reclaim, but to restore." Whispers exploded into murmurs. Someone muttered, "He owns all of this." Elsie could barely breathe. She stepped back, heart pounding. That night Daniel sat with her by the fire. She said nothing, eyes downcast. "You're angry," he said softly. "I'm confused," she replied. "You let me think you were just someone. But you're him, the Hartmore." "I was afraid," he said honestly. "Afraid that once you knew, you'd treat me differently, that you'd see what everyone else sees. Money, land, status, not me." Elsie looked at him, searching his eyes. "You should have trusted me." He nodded slowly. "You're right, and I want to make it right, all of it." The next morning, Daniel stood in the village square, no longer as a stranger, but as the rightful heir. The entire village had gathered, buzzing with speculation. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts. Men crossed their arms. Reverend Harrow offered a prayer and stepped back. Daniel spoke without flourish. "This valley belonged to my family for generations, but for too long we treated it as a possession, land to be owned, not lived with. That ends today." He turned to Mr. Alcott, who handed him a parchment. "This document transfers sections of land back to the village trust. Farms, mills, and public spaces will be co-managed by the community. No more tenancy, no more fear." A stunned silence fell, then murmurs of disbelief, then cheers. Elsie stood at the edge, wrapped in her mother's shawl, eyes wide. Later, Daniel found her at the cabin, where she was packing bread for delivery to the elderly. "You could live in the manor," he said. "Have everything you want." "I already do," she answered, not unkindly. Daniel paused. "What if I asked you to stay with me, not out of debt, but out of choice?" Elsie turned to him, cautious. "Why would someone like you want someone like me?" He stepped closer. "Because when I was lost, you didn't see a title or a name. You saw a man, and when I look at you, I see the bravest soul I've ever known." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. "Let me think," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "As long as you need." Weeks passed, and the valley began to change. With Daniel's backing, the village built a proper clinic and restocked the school library. Farmers received proper tools. The village council was reformed. Roads were cleared, the manor reopened, not as a mansion, but as a community hub. And still Daniel waited. He visited Elsie often, never pressing, never grandstanding. They worked side by side during the rebuilding efforts. He helped her patch her roof. She taught him how to chop firewood properly, without bruising his hands. One crisp morning, under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, Daniel took Elsie for a walk to the river, the very place she'd saved him. There, beside the thawed bank, he knelt, not in a grand ceremony, but with quiet sincerity. "I've waited for the right moment. I don't want to rescue you. I want to stand beside you, for life, if you'll let me." He held out a small ring, gold, simple, etched with a mountain flower. Elsie looked at it, then at him. "I don't need a manor," she whispered. "I just need someone who sees me." "I do," he said. She smiled, tears shining. "Then yes." The river sang in the background, soft and flowing. This time it didn't take, it gave. Not all celebrations come without shadows. Though Daniel and Elsie's engagement brought joy to many, a few voices in the valley began to murmur again. The old suspicions resurfaced. Only this time they weren't about Elsie's poverty. "She saved him just to marry into wealth," one farmer muttered. "Convenient timing, isn't it?" a baker's wife whispered. "From the edge of the forest to the heart of the manor." Elsie heard it. She always heard it. It hurt, but she bore it. She always had. What hurt more was the letter that arrived from a distant cousin of the Hartmores, a spiteful man named Philip Langley, who had long hoped to claim a stake in the valley's fortune. He sent no congratulations, only accusation. In the letter, Philip claimed that Elsie's father had once embezzled from the Hartmore estate. He included an old, faded ledger with forged entries, painting Elsie's father as a traitor and thief. Daniel read it in silence, his jaw clenched. Elsie watched the firelight dance across his face. "It's true, isn't it? That's what they've always believed." "I don't believe it," he said at last, "but I'm going to prove it." Elsie tried to smile, but her heart sank. Even now, the past refused to stay buried. The next day, Daniel rode to the old estate records office deep in Hartmore Hall. With the help of Alcott and the village historian, he unearthed boxes of archived documents, receipts, journals, original ledgers. Hours turned into days, and then he found it. A confession letter from a former estate clerk. The man had framed Elsie's father to cover his own debts. Her father had refused to stay and fight the accusation, fearing he would be jailed, so he had vanished to protect his wife and daughter. Daniel brought the letter to Elsie, hands trembling. She read it through tears. "My father wasn't a thief," she whispered. "No," Daniel said softly. "He was a protector, just like you." They buried the letter in a glass box under the old elm tree behind the cabin, a monument to truth and to second chances. The day after her father's name was cleared, Daniel arranged a gathering in the village square. Not a grand affair, just the people of Greystone, the way it had always been. He read the letter aloud. Silence followed, then murmurs of shame, regret, a few tears. Reverend Harrow stepped forward, weathered Bible in hand. "We owe her an apology," he said simply. One by one the villagers came. Some hugged her, others offered baskets of food. One woman left a pair of embroidered mittens on her porch. Elsie accepted their kindness with grace, but she did not forget. Forgiveness, after all, was not the same as forgetting. That night, she and Daniel walked through the village, hand in hand. Snowflakes floated down in gentle spirals. Every lamp glowed warmly. Every home welcomed them. "I don't know if I'm ready to live in a manor," she said, half teasing. "Then we won't," Daniel replied. "We'll build something new, together." He meant it. A week later, they began sketching plans for a new house, halfway between the cabin and the village. Built from stone and wood, modest but strong, a place with roots. And in one small room, facing east, they built a writing nook, just for her. A year passed. Greystone was no longer just a village. It had become a living testament to resilience, unity, and renewal. The new school opened in spring, with music and laughter echoing through its halls. The clinic was staffed by 2 full-time nurses and a rotating doctor from the city. The market bustled every Saturday with fresh bread, wild herbs, and handmade quilts. And Daniel and Elsie's home, the stone hearth, as villagers called it, stood proudly overlooking the river. Inside, Elsie sat at her writing desk, the window open to the breeze. In her hands was the first copy of her debut novel, The River's Secret. She had written it quietly, between harvesting squash and hosting council meetings. It wasn't just her story, it was the valley's story, of loss and hope, of injustice and redemption, of how a frozen river led to a love stronger than ice. Daniel entered the room carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. "You're on the front page of the Review Journal," he said with a grin. "They loved it." She smiled. "I didn't write it to be loved." He leaned in. "No, you wrote it because you lived it." Outside, children played near the river. Somewhere a church bell rang. The snow on the mountains glistened under sunlight, no longer threatening, but beautiful. Elsie took Daniel's hand and looked out over the valley. Once, she had been invisible. Now, she was the heart of a place that had nearly forgotten how to hope. And in the quiet hush of winter's end, one truth remained. The river had taken, and then it had given.